right, it's just 7 o'clock now, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you, first of all, everyone, for being here. This is the big week that that NASA's been excited about, and maybe you've all heard a lot about it. But I guess maybe I'll look to some of the younger members of the audience and ask you, who can tell me what an anniversary is? What's an anniversary?
Something Dad forgets.
Oh, I can't argue with that definition either. How about a birthday? What's a birthday? Come on, you guys know what birthday is. What's a birthday? I didn't know that. Hold on one second. Let me make sure that doesn't happen again. So an anniversary or birthday, this is a celebration that happens on an annual basis, right? Every year you celebrate your birthday, you turn a year older, right? And an anniversary is like a birthday, except it's not necessarily an anniversary of when you were born. It can be an anniversary for anything. When you get married, you have an anniversary. So an anniversary is something that happens every year. And so this year, 2019, is the 50th anniversary of, oops, not that. Hold on 1 second. There we go. It's the 50th anniversary of the moon landing on from the NASA moon landing. So I've got a little distracted by that, so let me get refocused here. So the fact that we were able to achieve this remarkable activity, the fact that we were able to land on the moon 50 years ago is kind of amazing. Let me actually, by show of hands, who was there or remembers? Who has memories of the moon landing? Tell me a little bit about what you remember. What do you remember about the moon landing?
I didn't fully appreciate it because I was about 9 years old.
Sure.
And it was clear that it was a really special thing, but I had no sense of just how hard it was to get there and all the difficulties they'd overcome. But it was still clear that it was a once-in-a-lifetime, amazing generational event.
Sure.
So it was exciting even without a full understanding.
Sure. Fantastic. Can you share? Did you show?
Oh yeah, I lived in Canada at the time,
Yeah.
and we were on vacation.
Yeah.
I was 6 and a half, and we were in the woods up north in Canada,
Wow.
Ontario. So reception was terrible. We had this little black and white TV with bunny ears that we brought with us, and my father was taking pictures
Wow.
of the television, and I just remember thinking, what, you think you're never going to see pictures of that again? You don't think somebody is archiving? Not that I knew the word archiving then, but
Sure.
I just thought it was hilarious that he was taking pictures of the television.
Sure.
Excited.
Absolutely. Anybody else any memories of the landing? I know you said that you remember being there, so do you have any
I
memories?
wasn't there, it was my birthday. So
Okay. Okay. So maybe you don't remember. I don't know how good your party was. But anybody else that you want to share? Sure.
I would have been about 5. I don't have any direct, I can't say that I have a direct memory or whether it's a reconstructed memory of having seen the footage so many times since then.
Yeah.
But I remember the later hoopla,
Yeah.
and I remember the toys and Tang. Tang was big, and at one point they came with this little plastic lunar rover, and I remember desperately wanting that toy.
Nice. Nice. Yeah. I mean, it's something that for those who were there, there's some sort of association, some sort of a memory, because it was really. This is something that, never mind that humans had never done before, it was almost inconceivable. Like this idea that humans could travel 250,000 miles to the moon, something that we had looked up and observed for all of civilization and had all these questions about. We actually achieved the engineering necessary in order to actually visit the planet, to visit the moon, the natural satellite of our planet. So to just give you a little bit of background, I didn't introduce myself. So my name's MJ Johnson. I'm a solar system ambassador, and so I go around and get the opportunity to talk to interested folks like yourselves about space science and about NASA and missions. There's, I already mentioned to some of the folks who are here already that there's printouts. Please come on in. That there's printouts in the back of the room that describe some current missions that JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory out of the California Technology, and NASA are currently executing. So I encourage you to take a look at that. There's NASA stickers if you're interested in those. I just ask that you hold on to the stickers once you actually leave the library. So that's what solar system ambassadors do, and if you have an interest in having me do one of these talks for an organization that would be interested, I'd be more than interested in understanding what your needs are. So let's start and talk about the moon and the Earth. And so I'm going to invite some volunteers. I need some volunteers from the audience. I'd like some younger members of our audience. So you two had your hands up. All right, young lady in the back would like to come on up. All right, okay, the three of you guys are gonna help me out here. So I'm gonna ask you to imagine if you could take the planet Earth and you could shrink it down to the size of this ball, okay? So now, I take the entire Earth and I shrink it down to this size, okay? And you're this tiny little itty bitty speck, here we are right on here. The moon, if we could shrink it also the same amount down, would the moon, do you think, be larger or smaller than the Earth? Smaller. Do you agree? What do you think? Larger. You think larger. What do you think? Smaller or larger? Smaller, okay. So it actually would be a little bit smaller. The question is how much smaller. So if I take this one here, you can hold it on the Earth there, okay? So which of these smaller balls here do you think would be the size of the moon? Which one do you think?
The tennis ball.
Tennis ball. What about you? Do you agree?
The small tennis.
The really small one, this little tiny little soccer ball, this big. What do you think? This one? It is this one. So this is about a 9-inch ball. This is about the size of a basketball, and it's a tennis ball. That's about the right ratio of size for the Earth and the Moon, if we can shrink them both down the same amount. And because it's so much smaller, there's less mass, which causes less gravity. Okay. So now let's continue this experiment here. So you're gonna hold on to my Earth there, and you wanna hold on to my moon? Okay, you hold on to my moon. So the moon goes around the Earth. It's in what's called an orbit with the Earth, right? And so the way orbits work is it kind of acts like there's a rope attached to one ball. Whoops, oh no, my moon. All right. There we go. So it kind of acts like this, right? So it kind of goes around the Earth roughly the same distance, and it kind of circles around and around. And every time around, we get the cycles of the moon. We get the new moon, a quarter moon, full moon, all that. So my question is, if you are the Earth and you're going to stand here next to me, and I'm going to ask you to hold on to the moon there, and you can hold on to the rope, and you're going to stand next to each other, right? How far do you guys need to stand away from us to be the appropriate distance of this size Earth from that size moon? How far do you think? Go ahead, stand there. And you go stand next to her. There you go. Is that how far do you think? Is that about that far? What do you think? You agree or disagree? She thinks that far. How far do you think? You agree, okay? What do you think?
It's supposed to be here.
Closer, you think?
Yeah.
So it's actually further than that, okay? So why don't you and me, we'll stand over here, okay? So stand over here. And I want you guys to start walking. We're gonna try and not kill anybody here walking by, so we'll stand right here. So why don't you stand next to each other and start walking away, and I'll tell you how far you have to go before you're the right distance, okay? You guys gotta stand together though, the moon's on this rope, right? So keep on, so you there, moon? Moon's still going out? Keep on going, moon. You gotta stay together. Keep, one line, just head out the door. Keep going, keep going. That's it. Okay, so you guys are standing next to me, you're just outside the door, that's about 24 feet. So that's the distance of this size Earth to scale of the distance to that size moon. That's a lot farther than most people think. Come on back in. Great job. Thank you very much. How about a round of applause for that? So that's pretty far. In actual space, that's about a quarter of, I said earlier, about a quarter of a million miles. Did you have a question?
Yeah, is that the Apollo 11 or the second?
Yeah, so you're asking me about the rocket? I'm going to tell you all about this rocket. This is actually called a Saturn V rocket. And the Apollo 11, which was the mission that successfully first landed on the moon, used a vehicle that looked a lot like this. It was a lot bigger, but it was like this. But it was a Saturn V.
Oh.
Yeah. Question?
Why? How come no girls have been on the Earth yet?
You know, I think that's an excellent question. What do you want to do when you grow up?
Go to Mars.
Well, I think that's a great idea. I think you could be the first woman to go onto the moon. Yeah, so the question was, why have there not been any girls who have been on the moon? And I said, I don't know the answer to that question. Actually, there is actually a real answer to that question. When they were looking for astronauts, the selection process, so the President of the United States decided that he wanted to use military personnel, and he specifically wanted to use jet pilots. And at the time, there weren't any women who were jet pilots. There are jet pilots who are women now, and there are astronauts who are women now. But at the time, they wanted to select specifically jet pilots, and there were only men who were jet pilots at the time, and that's why the astronauts were all boys. That's a good question. Thank you guys. You guys go have a seat.
But didn't the Russians have a female
Absolutely,
that
yes.
in orbit?
Yes, in fact, the second person in space was a woman, was a Russian. So the question was, okay, so why would we even think about going to the moon in the first place, right? So the thing is, there's lots of things that we do know now, thanks in large part to these missions that went, oh, thank you so much for my ball, thank you. Since we've been to the moon, that we've learned about it, but we had no idea about it. We didn't know many things that we now know much more about the moon in terms of what is it made out of, and did it form at the same time as the Earth, and what is it? Is there any life there? Like, we didn't know the answers to any of these questions. I mean, we didn't believe that there were cities or like any civilized intelligence, but we didn't know could life exist on the moon. No answers to any of these questions, and these questions existed basically as long as people could conceive of questions when they looked up at the moon. So we're talking about age-old questions, as old as humanity. And the other thing that answers the question of why go to the moon was this aspect of 20th century geopolitics, which I'll talk more about in just one second. So I do want to mention that there are connections between the Apollo launch to the moon, local connections to the Apollo launches to the moon, and our own backyard here in central Massachusetts. Does anybody know any connections? There are actually many, but there's one in particular I'm thinking of.
Robert Goddard was born in Worcester.
Absolutely. Robert Goddard was born in Worcester. Who is Robert Goddard? Can you know who that is?
The father of modern rocketry.
Yes, he was considered the father of modern rocketry. Specifically, he conceived of the idea of using liquid fuel to power rockets. This is not something that was really conceived of by science at the time. And so he was an engineer, and he was a professor and a physicist, and an inventor, born right here in Worcester in 1882, died in Baltimore, Maryland in 1945. And he conceived of these liquid-propelled rockets, built like several dozen of them, like 34 of them, between 1926 and 1941. And that's why I say you conceived of liquid fuel rockets. So I'm going to give you just a really quick sense of what Robert Goddard did. Hopefully, maybe.
With just such a design, on the 16th of March 1926, Robert Goddard finally launched the very first liquid-fueled rocket in history. The flight was brief. The rocket didn't go far or fast, but the potential was clear. Carrying liquid oxygen on board meant rockets could fly beyond the Earth's atmosphere.
And with that, Robert Goddard imagined we could go to the moon.
So that's pretty cool. So as early as the early 1900s, early 20th century, there's this conception of, okay, well, we can actually build a vehicle that potentially could go to the moon. There actually is a park. If you go over, so those launches that very, very early footage was shot from, that was actually shot from this farm that Goddard actually launched those early rockets from. It's right over in Auburn. And there's a park there you can actually visit today. There's a picture of it here. It's right on Upland Street in Auburn, and it's got a little rocket here, and so you can actually visit some of these local connections that are connect our communities to the Apollo program. I encourage you to take a look at it. So listen to the sound for just 1 second. So somebody already said, what was that?
Sputnik.
That was the sound of something called Sputnik. Does anybody know what Sputnik was besides the gentleman who just named it Sputnik? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's the Sputnik 1. It's made from Russia.
That's right, the Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 was very significant for a lot of reasons, but the scientific reason was it was the first man-made object that we were able to put into an orbit around the Earth. And as you say, the Russians were able to do this in 1957, which is when it was launched. Question?
Isn't this the first satellite?
It is. It's the first satellite. And so this was in a period of time, you have to understand, this was after World War II, and the United States and Russia were effectively beginning to engage in a political posturing of one-upsmanship. And so they really were, on the world stage, posturing one another as the most technologically advanced nation on the country and on the planet, with the ability to deliver the most compelling scientific advancements. And so Russia and the United States began to have this sort of competition to demonstrate their superiority. And when Russia launched this satellite in 1957, that was a clear signal to the world, the United States hadn't done this, that it was a clear signal to the world that they were a technologically superior nation compared to what the United States had achieved up until that point. And that sound, that beeping sound, which was then played on radio broadcasts, television broadcasts, that freaked Americans out because they didn't really know what it was. They didn't know what the sound meant. They didn't know what it was carrying, some super secret signal. It turned out it had no real specific scientific specific purpose, but it had the purpose of unnerving the military and the president's cabinet and the president. Everyone started getting very, very freaked out by what is Russia doing. Now, this is in 1957, so this is a little bit more than 50 years ago. Not that much more than 50 years ago. And so this began a series of milestones where, first of all, Sputnik launched this, Russia launched this satellite into orbit, and then the United States did it. So the United States launched Explorer 1, which was the first American satellite to orbit the Earth. And then there was these probes to the moon, first a Russian probe that was able to crash land in the moon, but still it made it there. And so Luna was there, and then the Ranger made it there as this additional United States mission. And then the thing that really sort of got the world's attention of this whole escalating space race was the first man to actually go into space. And what's really amazing is the first man to go into space, Yuri Gagarin, who was, of course, a Soviet, was not only the first man in space, but they had him in orbit. And he orbited, I don't think, 108 minutes, 89 minutes, 108-minute flight. It doesn't make sense. 108 minutes, I'm not quite sure. Yes, of his 108 minutes of flight, 89 minutes of that were in space. And so he orbited around the Earth. He was up there for, an hour and a half. That's a really long time to go from nothing, nobody in space, to all of a sudden there's a person in space and we can actually successfully orbit them around the Earth. So that's a pretty amazing milestone. And then, as someone mentioned, they followed this up with the first woman in space. Valentina, and I can't remember her last name, was the first woman in space, and she also was able to orbit the Earth as well. And so this started, this was an untenable situation for the United States government, where time after time they were being beat to the punch by the Russians. And so in order to effectively reestablish American superiority among these two superpowers that were battling for supremacy after World War II, John Kennedy famously decided that he assembled all of his military, assembled his cabinet and everyone, his advisors, to understand, well, what could they actually do that they could definitely try and have a shot at beating the Russians? Because these incremental steps, the Russians were ahead of them. And so what they decided was they could try and go to the moon. They thought they could actually do that before the Russians, because it was so audacious and the technology was so unknown. There were so many questions of what it would take to actually do this that they didn't think that the Russians could possibly have an advantage on that front. And so in 1962, John Kennedy gave this speech at Rice University where he officially kind of proclaimed that this was going to be the goal, to go to the moon before the end of the decade, as he said, decade. So I'm actually going to play this. I'm not just going to play the one famous part, which is "We Choose the Moon." You'll hear that part, but I want you to hear some of the framing of his argument for why this is a priority for the United States. And it's a priority because of the ideals that the United States could
For the
stand.
eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom and peace. We have vowed that we shall not see space filled with weapons of mass destruction, but with instruments of knowledge and understanding. Yet the vows of this nation can only be fulfilled if we in this nation are first, and therefore we intend to be first. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
So there you go. We often hear that one little snippet, and of course, it's always amusing when you just hear the little snippet. He says, we choose to go to the moon and do the other things. It's like, what are the other things? Well, those are the other things: climb Everest and have a right to beat Texas and all that. But you get a sense for this was not just about military superiority. It's not just about technological superiority. This was about a banner of freedom, wrapping the planet. This was about knowledge. This is about science as opposed to oppression. And so it really frames the entire thing as this, this is a dire consequence if we can't achieve something that allows us to get to the moon first. And so in the midst of this, of course, since 1962, so NASA did exist at this point. I mean, this is early days. And so there was a program in place at the time. So Project Mercury was really the first, this was the United States response to Gagarin's flight in orbit around the Earth. And so Mercury was the first effort. There were 7 astronauts and missions just basically to get human, Americans up into space, right? And it took, I think, about 3 missions in before they were even able to succeed with their first orbit. So they had just the very, very beginnings of a manned flight program into space. Not nearly what was necessary in order to actually learn all the things that were necessary to actually get to anything as audacious as get to the moon. But to try and get a sense of all of the things, like getting to the moon it's not just one problem. It's many, many layers of problems that you need to figure out in terms of getting some sort of a rocket off the planet, and then figuring out how you're going to get that rocket to the moon, and then how you're actually going to successfully land this thing on the moon. So many different complicated problems. And so I'm going to play you another clip here that tries to give you a sense of all of the challenges that you need to overcome and master in order to do this. They didn't want to do it just once, they wanted to do it multiple times. And they had to get, obviously, really good at all this. I will mention there's one bit of language in here, but it's not too bad. So it's family friendly.
All right, here's what we're going to have to do.
Folks, to get a man to the moon ahead of the Soviets. We've all been planning, meeting, talking, dreaming, but here is brass tacks, so we're all on the same page. Get a man to the moon. We first have to get him into orbit. Our friends from Russia already did that. That's good for them. Popgun shot with Al Shepard was a nice start, but we all know we don't get cigars for them. The Mercury flight's coming up will get us into orbit long enough for us to figure out how to stay up there for a bit. We do that, we have objective number 1 made. EVA, spacewalk, objective number 2. Once in orbit, get out of the spacecraft, go for a walk, see if we can build a suit to protect the man outside, see if he can maneuver, see if he can get back in. We need this for emergencies, of course, but we ain't going to the moon to sit inside and take pictures. We're going to walk around up there, and we'll need the equipment to allow a man to do that. Rendezvous, 2 spacecraft meeting up in orbit. You want to have fun? Come over to my house. You stand in the backyard, I'll stand in the front yard. You throw a tennis ball over my roof. I'll try to hit it with a rock as it comes sailing over. That's what we're going to have to do. 2 spacecraft flying 5 miles a second, hundreds of miles up with the communication system spread all over the world like so many trading stamps. Then we're going to have to dock, join up, develop the specs and hardware for 2 spacecraft to first rendezvous, then to come together all safe and stable. Objective 5, long duration space flight. Take 2 weeks to fly to the moon and back. What is being in zero-G that long going to do to the human body? Will the crew's hearts stop beating? Will they be able to take a craft without fouling up the flight controls? I'm betting they can't. Still, we need to prove it. We need to prove them all proficiently over and over again. We have to get so good at it that we bet the lives of our crews without flinching. We get them up there. We accomplish the mission objectives, and we get them back home every time.
So that gives you a sense that this really is not a problem. And so there were teams, there were hundreds of engineers, thousands of people who were tasked with this. And again, Kennedy was trying to do this before the end of the decade. So this is 62, he makes this audacious claim he wants to do it. They basically got this limited window of 6-7 years to try and figure out how they're actually going to do it. The first thing that they undertook was a program called Gemini. NASA pronounced it Gemini. So they called it Gemini because all the missions, the manned missions here, this was after Mercury. Mercury was happening. those were not oriented towards learning to get to the moon. Gemini was conceived of as trying to learn the things necessary in order to be able to do everything necessary to get to the moon. All those things that you just heard that actor describing. And so they call it Gemini because the capsule actually had these two astronauts in their configuration when they would launch, and Gemini is the twins in the Zodiac. And so this was where they started to learn how to do low Earth orbit. This is where they learned how to do spacewalks. This is where they learned how to dock to spacecraft. I read a really excellent article this morning about the engineer who conceived of this whole concept of using multiple vehicles to actually get to the moon. It was not like a foregone conclusion. In fact, it was a very unpopular idea when he conceived of it. Werner von Braun, who is the architect of the actual rockets, didn't want to do it. He wanted to fly this giant rocket to the moon and then land it. And basically this engineer was able to prove that having multiple rockets together would be the most efficient way of doing it. Ultimately, that was the idea that won out. So Gemini takes place from 65 to 66. So there's 10 Gemini crews that fly in low Earth orbit in order to get all these skills necessary in order to begin to have a shot at trying to go to the moon. And then they spin up Apollo. So Apollo 1, obviously by the name, the first manned mission of the Apollo program, was scheduled to take place in February of 1967. And so everyone is just racing. There's 3 years left to try and make Kennedy's goal of getting to the moon before the decade is over. Everybody recognized that going to the moon was inherently extraordinarily dangerous. Every single astronaut understood that they were, potentially putting their lives at risk when they were going to go and undertake this endeavor to go to the moon. What no one really thought about, or I can't say no, didn't think about, but didn't think would realistically happen, was that there would be an accident that would cause loss of life in a training simulation actually while still on Earth. And that was exactly what happened with Apollo 1. Apollo 1, they were in what's called a plugs out test. They were on the mission pad. They had the astronauts inside a pressurized cabin, which turned out to be one of the contributing factors of the accident. And they experienced a flash fire inside of the capsule. The fire took the lives of all 3 astronauts, and basically the entire program ground to an immediate halt. And so there was all these questions like, how can we possibly continue to do this? People are dying now in our effort to try and go to the moon. Is it worth it? People are now have sacrificed their lives. And so there was a complete teardown of the entire program. They redesigned the command module, which was the module up on top, which is where the astronauts were when the fire happened inside of their craft. And incredibly, the decision was made that they would start all over, go back to scratch. They would figure out the wiring that contributed to the fire. They were in an environment which was nearly 100% oxygen, in a pressurized environment, which was incredibly dangerous. So they rectified that, and they also redesigned the capsule itself. The original capsule had a hatch that opened inward, and so now you pressurize that cabin. There's no way to open up that door. It has to open inside. You have to depressurize the cabin in order to do that. So they made it so that the door opened outward. They could get people in and out of it in case of an emergency. So they continued forward even after Apollo 1 and even after the sacrifice of the Apollo astronauts. And they continued a year later, almost 18 months later, in 1968, with the first successful manned flight of the Apollo program, which was Apollo 7. In between here, there were unmanned missions where they were proving the systems, which is why the numbers are different. And I was mentioning to somebody who was asking me about this rocket here. So the Apollo 7 mission actually had a very slightly different configuration than all the other Apollo missions, and that was because it didn't need to leave Earth orbit. So basically, the Apollo 7 used a Saturn 1B configuration, which allowed them to get into orbit and actually begin to test the systems that would ultimately carry them onto the moon. And so I want to give you guys, a little sense of this machine that is the most powerful machine in terms of horsepower and thrust that really mankind has ever made. So the Saturn V, this is a model of the Saturn V here. And then there's all these kinds of crazy bullets in here. It's equivalent of 160 million horsepower, 500,000 sports cars. My favorite one on here. So each one of these engines, these are called the the F1 engines. You can see these are people. This is the actual size of on its side of the bottom stage. This stage here, the S1C, I believe it's called, and these 5 F1 engines, each of which have these gimbals on them, so they can actually direct this thing into space. And so you can see how tiny, tiny people are compared to these engines. These F1 engines, each one of them would consume an equivalent of a 10,000 gallon swimming pool every 3 seconds. So you're just dumping fuel into these things. The amount of energy that they would take and then generate these 7.5 million pounds of thrust. You know, the full size of this thing, there's another picture of it here, but this is 363, this is like a skyscraper. This is like many stories tall. That you're basically trying to put a building onto some sort of a rocket and then launch the building up into space. Okay, this is, and there's actually a pretty good description of, you know, the challenges of, well, you can build a bigger rocket, but then you need to have more fuel, and then your rocket gets heavier, so you need a bigger rocket. So this balancing act of how do you design something that actually has enough fuel to actually generate the thrust necessary and to accomplish the mission objectives. This is a balancing act which modern rocket engineers still deal with, of trying to figure out how to strike that balance. So actually, I'm going to skip over this video in the interest of time. And then, so this is actually a disassembled Saturn V rocket on its side. I believe this is Johnson Space Center. Again, just mostly for scale, so you can see how tiny the people are with this thing. And then there's a description of what these things actually were like when they actually fired.
In November 1967, 2 years and 1 month before Kennedy's deadline, the Saturn V rocket has its first unmanned test flight.
We got as close to it as we could, something like 2.5 miles away.
Among the spectators is astronaut Michael Collins.
When the engines ignited, it didn't seem like a big deal. And then a shockwave came. And the shockwave got you in the viscera, got you in the brain, got you shaking. If you ever want to know what power meant, that was it.
The 5 F1 engines and everything else work perfectly.
So just getting, and this is actually taken from a NASA program, which is actually airing this week. It aired actually originally last year. It's fascinating because just getting those engines to fire and not explode was like a massive engineering undertaking. Basically, as you might expect, you're putting these enormous amounts of thrust on these engines. They tended to misbehave, and when they misbehaved, they would misbehave catastrophically and they would explode. So they had to solve that problem long before they would put people into a vehicle that they were going to launch into space. So they figure out how to fire these things. They've actually made some progress now. Apollo 8 was really the first mission to take humans to the moon and back again. So Apollo 8 was the first manned mission, as I said, in this configuration, Saturn V. It was really the first time that the public at large had the opportunity to kind of go along for the ride with them, right? So they were able to do radio broadcasts, they were able to do television broadcasts from the spaceship, from the spacecraft. And this was, sort of kind of amazing. Something you could have, astronauts in your living room, and take pictures, of them actually broadcasting from their capsule on their way to the moon. And so it really is, Apollo 8 is pretty significant for a lot of reasons, but it's probably most significant because it really is the first time that humans leave the Earth. We were no longer in orbit, we're no longer hanging out around here. And this terminology that NASA uses, and NASA, like many engineers, they like their acronyms, so they call it TLI, or Trans-Lunar Injection. And TLI is basically the maneuver where they execute the firing of engines in order to leave the orbit of the Earth and head towards the moon. And Deke Slayton, who was the Capcom, the astronaut who was responsible for communicating with the astronauts, said that, when he gave the order, he just said, okay, gentlemen, clear for TLI, and then they fire up the engine and they are on their way. And he's like, the sort of the importance of that moment isn't really captured in the sort of the poetry of TLI. You're clear for TLI. It's like, you are clear to leave the planet Earth. You may now go on your way, boys, and have fun on your way, leaving the planet. And there is a very famous Christmas Eve broadcast. They were invited to, to do a little something, some sort of, because again, they had this capability of broadcasting the capsule, and they chose to do this Christmas Eve broadcast where they read from the book of Genesis, which is quite famous. The other thing it's very, very famous for, does anybody know what Apollo 8 is also famous for?
The photo.
The photo. So this is a slightly cropped version of this photo. So when the astronauts, when the astronauts go to the moon, they would put them into what's called this free return trajectory. The idea being that if something happens and you can't fire your rockets, and you don't want people to get trapped, at the moon if you can help it, so they put them on a trajectory which basically loops them around the moon, so that if they need to, they have a much better chance of kind of slingshotting back and returning back to the Earth if they absolutely need to. Or they can fire their rockets and stay in orbit around the moon, which was the intended goal. So Apollo 8 was also significant because it was the first time that astronauts had gone around the far side of the moon. Does anyone know what have you heard the term dark side of the moon? You heard that?
Yeah.
Okay. What does the dark side of the moon mean?
So it's like the other side of the moon, so when the moon is spinning,
Yep.
like you can't see the other side.
That's right.
Because the moon is not spinning. It's like basically just the spinning on the Earth, but itself is not spinning.
That's right. So
Yeah, so you can't see the other side.
that's right. So we can't see the other side, and that's often referred to as the dark side of the moon, which is erroneous. It is not dark. There is sunlight on the far side of the moon, it's just we can't see it. When there's a new moon, there's sunlight on the far side of the moon. When there's a crescent moon, most of the sunlight is on the far side of the moon. So it's not the dark side of the moon, it's just the far side of the moon. And so it was the first time, so Apollo 8 was the first time that astronauts went around the far side of the moon. And when that happens, you lose radio contact with them because there's no radio operates in line of sight, and there were no satellites to relay the signal, so we lost them for as long as they are. So those are tense moments, right? So they're going around the far side of the moon, and everybody in Houston Mission Control is just waiting for them to come back into radio communications so they can find out how it all went. And so they're going around the far side of the moon, and as they're going around the far side of the moon, they're observing this sort of amazing terrain. What is amazing, one of the things that's amazing to me about this photograph is just what the moon looks like in the photo. And I'll talk about that in a second. God bless you. But they come around the far side, and all of a sudden, the Earth rises in front of them. And this is, I mean, they did enormous, immense, ridiculous amounts of training for this. Nobody really thought of this. Nobody anticipated what it would be like to be over this incredibly alien landscape where there's literally nothing recognizable on the far side of the moon, because we hadn't seen the far side of the moon up to that point. And then to come around that and to see this rising Earth, where every single person, every single thing that anybody has ever known resides. And so they quick grabbed their Hasselblad cameras, and they obviously shot these photographs, which became a real symbol for kind of the perspective, this whole new perspective that we have. It's not just Earth at the center of everything. It's like, no, Earth is a planet, and it has a natural satellite, and that is the moon. This photograph, I think that the view of the terrain of the moon, to me, is just truly amazing, because it really does look like nothing that I've seen on this planet. I almost think it looks like a rendered video game scene, right? Like the moon, and it really is something that is not something we can experience here, because of course it isn't here. So that was, it's called Earthrise, was what the name was given to the photograph in Apollo 8. So in the interest of trying to get through some of these different missions to describe kind of what happens, so Apollo 9 was the first manned mission which tested all of the hardware necessary to ultimately execute the mission to land on the moon. And so I'm going to probably need some more volunteers now. So if I can maybe get, who has not had a chance to come on up? You want to come on up? One over here? You want to come up? Okay. Cool. All right. So this is, I guess I said, the mission of the model of the Saturn V rocket. So there are different parts of the rocket that are responsible for executing different parts of the mission in order to ultimately get to the moon. So on the launch pad, it starts off, it's in its fully configured state, and so when it fires these 5 F1 engines, these are what are necessary to basically begin to break free of the Earth's gravity. So why don't you go ahead and grab that bottom part there, I'm going to hold the top part here, and just pull it towards you. There you go. All right, so now, basically from the time of launch to about 2 minutes into the mission, this first stage, this is where these enormous F1 rockets that are consuming enormous amounts of fuel, kerosene, liquid oxygen, conceived of the idea by Robert Goddard here in Worcester, that basically begins to get you free of the bonds of gravity here on Earth. So then we're sort of done with that stage. Then the next stage here, this second stage, will fire effectively to begin to get it all the way up into Earth orbit. And so why don't you go ahead and grab on that bottom section there. There you go. Thank you very much. So then we have a second stage here. We dispose of this. This falls back to Earth. And so then we have this third stage, and actually all the way up at the top here, this is a mission. This is a rescue rocket, which is designed, in the case, basically all the way up until orbit, to carry the command module away from the rocket in the event of some kind of emergency. So they jettison that. So now they're actually effectively into the Earth's orbit with this third stage. So then they wait for that command to come from mission control that they're cleared for translunar injection. And then this rocket fires again in order to actually begin to carry them to the moon. On the way to the moon, there's these two sections. So these are the primary things that we think about that are responsible for the Apollo mission. So we have this part here, which is called the command module. This is what's called the service module. What do you guys think is in the service module? So what's the command module is where the astronauts are during launch, and so what do you think is going on back in here? What do we need the service module for? Come on, guys.
Are they still fuel?
Yes, fuel. What else do they need?
Power, electricity.
Power, electricity, food, definitely oxygen. And they were able to actually make their, because of the propellants that they were able to use, they actually got water as a freebie out of the hydrogen and oxygen that they had along with them. But yes, all those things, everything that they needed in order to basically stay alive on the way to the moon is part of the service module, including this big giant engine that was also responsible for getting them there. And then we have this part, which is what's known as the lunar module, or as the astronauts called it, the LEM. Question?
So what happened if someone got stuck on the moon?
That is a really good question. You know what? I'm actually going to show a video because people thought about what that might mean. But that is an excellent question of what would happen if people got stuck on the moon. Okay? We'll come back to that. So basically they execute the maneuver to have the translunar injection, and then on their way there, this part, the service module and the command module, separate out from this third and final stage, and then this opens up, and inside of here is actually where they stored this incredibly sensitive machine, which they needed to actually land on the moon, the lunar module. And so then they perform this docking maneuver where they actually dock with the lunar lander, and hopefully, maybe, are able to extract it. They did a much better job at this than I did, thankfully. So they were able to extract the lunar module from this third stage, and then this, in some cases, they would fire this and actually effectively abandon it in space. Later Apollo missions actually commanded this to crash into the moon, okay, so this third stage. So then they're done with this third stage, and then this is the configuration for most of the trip, where they have basically what you see on the screen here. And they actually are able to, basically commute between the command module and the lunar module. Most of the time they hung out here in the command module until they were ready to actually attempt the landing on the moon. And so once they were ready to attempt the landing on the moon, they were able to separate the command module from the lunar module. The command module would stay, so one astronaut would stay behind in the command module. He would continue to orbit around the moon. The lunar module would descend down to the surface of the moon. Hopefully that was the plan. They would land, they would hop out, they would have their experience on the moon, and then the base of this, which has what's called the descent stage, this descent engine down here, would actually remain behind. So this actual descent stage became the launch platform for this ascent stage when they were ready to leave the moon. And the reaction that caused this thrust was actually a chemical reaction. They didn't want it to be a powered reaction because they didn't want, if they couldn't have electricity or something. So literally it was chemicals that came together in order to combust and cause the thrust that allowed the ascent module to leave the moon. So the ascent module would then ascend away from the moon. It would then dock up with the command module. They would return. Once they had all the astronauts aboard, they would discard the lunar module. And then once they were back using the service module and the command module, they would return back to Earth, where the command module ultimately would separate from the service module with this very important heat shield on the back here, because they then needed to enter back through the atmosphere. The atmosphere, when you have an object coming through it, generates an enormous amount of heat. And so they needed to protect the astronauts from burning up on re-entry. They would pass through the atmosphere, these parachutes would open up, and then they would descend back into the ocean. Thank you guys so much for helping me with that. Thank you. So there we go. And actually then the very last part here, we can't even hardly see this here, but these three There's 3 little tiny little astronauts. Can you guys see those? Really, really tiny. So that's the amazing thing. It's like, so all this hardware, and like I showed you, like to scale, like what this was like, all of this is designed to carry just 3 individuals to the moon and back. That's a lot of equipment necessary to do this thing that nobody had ever done before. And so Apollo 10 was effectively what I just described to you, all the orchestration, all those pieces of equipment, all that hardware necessary to land a man on the moon. Apollo 10 was the rehearsal for that. So Apollo 10 was the mission that did effectively everything that Apollo 11 ultimately was going to do, but except for landing on the moon. They came within 47,000 feet of the lunar surface. And I've not heard interviews with the astronauts who were on the lunar module, but I have to imagine that is a tantalizing, just it's right there. I've read actually that they didn't have the fuel necessary to actually accomplish the actual landing. Because it was like, NASA's little safety valve in case they were like, you guys really, no, you can't land on the moon, like you have to come back. And so they basically did absolutely everything from a rehearsal perspective for what was ultimately going to be the attempt to land on the moon in July of 1969. So that's in May 26th, May 18th to May 26th, 1969. And so then we get to Apollo 11. So Apollo 11 is the one that everybody knows, right? Well, if you know of the Apollo missions, Apollo 11 tends to be the one people know because it is the one that landed on the moon first. But hopefully, in me kind of describing this to you, like the multiple missions, both unmanned and manned, all of those were necessary to learn all the things that we needed to learn in order to actually ultimately successfully attempt a landing on the moon in July of 1969. And 50 years ago, at this point, so this is the 18th, so 50 years ago, they were still on their way. They were in transit. They would have launched on Tuesday. So Tuesday was the July 16th, was when they actually launched from Florida. So they were still in transit on their way to the moon. July 20th was when they actually made it to the moon. So Michael Collins, you just heard in that video talking about the the Saturn V rocket on the launch pad and what it felt to experience that was in the command module. And Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were in the lunar module that descended. I recently saw a interview with Michael Collins where he talked about the fact, he lamented the fact, this was before they went to the moon. And so they're interviewing him and they were like, so are you okay, like being all by yourself, like in the command module? He's like, oh, I'll be fine, but I will note that, while I'm in the command module, there's no television in the command module. So of all the people on the planet, I'll be like one of the only humans who won't actually get to watch this whole little event. So maybe somebody make a recording for me so I can see it when I get back. So he was hanging out in the command module while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were descending down to the lunar surface. And of all the photographs that I've seen as they were preparing for the mission for Apollo 11, I really like this photograph just because this is Neil Armstrong here on the left-hand side in the middle. This is Michael Collins in the foreground, Buzz Aldrin, Deke Slayton, William Anders in back left. So this is their boss over here on the right-hand side. And I've had breakfast with my boss, right? And these guys are just hanging out. They're literally having steak and eggs, and they're drinking coffee, and they're just people. They're humans. Like they're doing their human thing, but they're not humans like me. I can tell you that. But it's just. It's this, amazing perspective where they're, literally discussing what they're going to do at work that day. Just they're going to happen to go to the moon. So literally, this is from the morning of the launch. And so then I'll just give you a quick little rundown of the major milestones of the Apollo 11 mission.
15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4. 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Now, 4 forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds forward, drift. Contact lights. Okay, engine stop. Tranquility Base, here's the Eagle Red Lightning. Rocket Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys
Armstrong is on the moon. Neil Armstrong, 38-year-old American, standing on the surface of the moon. on this July 20th, 1969.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That's beautiful, man. And there's a stark beauty all its own. It's much of the high desert of United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Beautiful, beautiful. Isn't that something? Magnificent sight out here. Magnificent desolation. Tranquility Base, unit, guided transportation, unit ping, and you're cleared for takeoff. Roger, understand. We're number 1 on the runway. 7, 6, 5, mission on passing.
There's the descent stage coming up from the descent stage.
Very smooth. Very quiet ride.
So the actual landing itself was pretty, a little bit harrowing at the very end. A couple of things happened. First of all, they were starting to get, as Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were descending to the moon's surface, the computer, which they had, which was not nearly as technologically advanced as the things that we like carry in our pockets, probably wasn't even as advanced as the toasters most of us have in our homes at this point, but it kept throwing these errors, and it was because the computer was getting too much information, and it kept throwing these errors, which basically indicated that it was getting too much information, these 1201, 1202 errors. And so they cleared those, and they said, okay, you're good to land, don't worry about those problems, we can work through those. They're not problems that are going to jeopardize the mission. And then, as they were descending to the moon, their computer basically was taking them to where the mission objectives had planned for them to land. And as they were approaching it, Neil Armstrong, who was like, by every standard in this program of amazing men who were able to do incredible things, psychologically, physiologically. He was like their gold standard. That's why they chose him to be one of the lunar landing astronauts. He decided that the computer was going to take them into harm's way, that they were going to go into this crater, there were these very large boulders that were going to basically not allow them to either land or to take off afterwards. And so he decided to take over manually. And so he manually landed the lunar module on the surface of the moon by taking it past this boulder-strewn field, which was their original landing spot, and taking it into an area where they could actually land safely. And when he did that, they had about 30 seconds of fuel left before they needed to effectively abort or land the thing. And so it was pretty tight in terms of what they actually had, but he set it down. Apparently he set it down so gently that under normal circumstances, the lunar module would set pretty well into the surface of the moon. It really didn't actually go very far into the actual surface of the moon because Neil Armstrong landed it so gently on the surface of the moon. So this is a diagram of the site. This is actually a photograph up here of the actual site of Apollo 11. This is actually shot by a modern mission that is orbiting around the moon called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. And so that was taken from overhead by the LRO in the last 5 years or so. And then this is a diagram, a schematic of the actual landing site. So here's the lunar module here. Here's the paths of where they actually walked around to observe this crater that they named Little West. This double crater here. This is where the TV camera is mounted, the flag. You can see kind of the accessories here. So how big is this? Okay, they walked around the moon. How far did they wander? How far did they go? So to give you a sense of this, I mapped an image from Google Maps onto the diagram to give you a sense at the same scale of the lunar lander. And I did it actually with where we are right now. So this is to scale. So this diagram I just showed you here, this is measuring 20 meters. This is how engineers measure. So this is 20 meters. So that's about the scale. Literally, if we walked outside to the front of the building, and then we walked around the back of the building to the parking lot, that's about the scale that we're talking about here to actually sort of explore the environment around us. So, come on in. There's a couple of seats up here. Seats back here. It's okay. So, it sort of begins to sort of paint a picture of, okay, well, how far they they were really, the whole purpose of this was to get them to the moon, to get them outside of the lander, and to get them back in and to get them back safely, and they achieved that. And that was the first time that we ever stepped in. Really, the moon is the only object that humans have stepped on outside of the Earth. And so you asked, the question was asked earlier, well, what happened, what if they didn't make it back? That was a real, that wasn't just like a possibility, that was a very real reality. Like when, I'm pretty sure that it was Neil Armstrong, in an interview was asked later after the mission of, what they thought the odds were. He thought it was 50-50, like, 50-50 that they successfully executed their mission. And so there was a speechwriter in the White House, Bill Safire, who actually penned, and I'll just play a little bit of it for you, of the actual, read by the actor Benedict Cumberbatch, of the speech that was written of what the president was going to say if they couldn't get the astronauts back. Oops, meeting? Hold on.
In the event of moon disaster, fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery. But they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice. These two men are laying down their lives in mankind's most noble goal, the search for truth and understanding.
So just give you a sense, I won't play the whole thing. You can find this on YouTube, you can watch it yourselves. But this was like a very real possibility. In fact, and Michael Collins, who was the command module pilot, he had to consider the possibility that if they could not get off the moon or they crashed on the moon, whatever would happen, that he was going to have to come home anyway. And in his own words, he would say, then I would have to live with the fact that I was a marked man. So these were real life and death odds. Like this was, we sort of look at this as an extraordinary accomplishment, which it was, but this was incredibly dangerous endeavor that really was with untried technology. But the reality was, we actually did it, and not only did we do it once, but we did it more than once. Does anybody know how many men, we already covered that it was men because they were all the fighter pilots, but how many men walked on the moon? We know it's at least 2. Is it 4? 6? 12.
Should be 10.
There's 12. So there were 6 missions that successfully landed on the moon. There were 7 that were planned, and actually they were planned beyond Apollo 17, but through 17 there were 7 that were planned. Apollo 13 did not land successfully on the moon. It wasn't able to land on the moon. But each one of these missions carried 2 astronauts to the surface of the moon. I'll talk more about that in a second. But Apollo 13, so Apollo 12, so again, this was immediately after Apollo 11. This was able to perform this precision landing where they were, so once we were able to do it once we were able to say, okay, we've done it. We can land men successfully on the moon. The immediate, beat the Russians, accomplished Kennedy's goal. Kennedy was assassinated in '63, didn't get to see the fulfillment of his vision. But they did it, they successfully beat the Russians to the moon. So then, NASA starts really actually asking the questions which I started with, what can we learn as a result of this endeavor? What can we find out about the geology of the moon? Where does it come from? How did it form? Is it like the Earth? Is it very different from the Earth? And so, starting with Apollo 12, they started trying to pick sites that would actually really begin to allow astronauts to retrieve moon samples and to begin to conduct science experiments that would help answer some of those questions. And so, with Apollo 12, I'll skip over this video for now. With Apollo 12, this will give you a little bit of a sense of, how, just in one mission, right, going from Apollo 11 to Apollo 12, first of all, there's more consideration of the scientific value of what we can actually learn when we go to the moon. And so this is, again, a photograph from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter of the site. This dotted line is my attempt to try and give you a sense of what is actually captured inside of the photograph here. You can see where the lunar module is here on the X. That's where the lunar module is. And so, for scale, comparing to Apollo 11, the mission which landed, immediately before this mission, this is the Apollo 11 site, to scale. Okay. So now we start opening things up a little bit, right? So now we're talking about landing on the moon, and we walk from the library down almost to the Civic Center over St. Mary's Church over here, up to the cemetery, past the historic district. this is, we're starting to open things up, and this opens up the possibilities of actually exploring the terrain around the lander and trying to learn a little bit by retrieving geologically significant evidence from the surface of the moon. So then, Apollo 13, how many folks have, there's a movie, a famous movie starring Tom Hanks. Have you seen the movie? So it's a great movie, and it does a very good job of describing what NASA was able to achieve even in the face of extreme adversity and effectively making really, really difficult decisions, okay? So Apollo 13, I already mentioned, I kind of gave away the punchline, wasn't able to land on the moon. It wasn't able to do that because it suffered an explosion. There was an explosion in the service module. We talked a little bit about the service module, which contains, importantly, we talked about electricity and what else we talked about?
Food, water.
Food and oxygen. The oxygen was the big one. So there was an explosion which caused their oxygen tanks to be disrupted, and so they were venting oxygen out into space. And so in order to effectively, they immediately or very quickly arrived at the conclusion that in the state of the condition of the command module, service module after the explosion, that there was no way they could realistically attempt a landing on the moon. And this was when they were on the way to the moon, right? So that's why they abandoned that part of the mission. The mission became just retrieving the astronauts and getting them back to the Earth safely. And so the lunar module, and this was really the credit to the engineering behind the entire program, the lunar module basically served as what they called their lifeboat. So the command module was compromised, the oxygen in it was compromised. They began to use the lunar module as a place where the three of them basically went to, to breathe and to experience warmth and try and at least be in an environment that would allow them to make it, around the moon in that free trajectory we talked about earlier, and then back to the Earth. They knew that they needed the command module. The command module is the only part of the mission that would allow them to actually return back through the atmosphere. So the biggest, concern was that the explosion in the service module caused some damage to the heat shield as part of this, the command module. Luckily, that wasn't the case, and they were able to return back to Earth through the atmosphere. But the lunar module and the command module and all these things that were not, they were operating way outside the specs of anything that was designed for the purpose of effectively acting as a lifeboat for the astronauts, was able to allow them to survive and to actually ultimately make it back to Earth. So even though this was this set of challenges, they didn't think they were necessarily going to make it through, they were able to make it back to Earth successfully. So Apollo 14, more lunar samples. They did actually devise as a precursor to what they ultimately came out with, this sort of almost like looks like a golf cart kind of thing, right? But this was designed for them to actually put tools in and carry along with them so they could actually execute this geologic investigation while they were actually on the moon. And they were able to, actually begin to return enough lunar rocks to actually piece this picture together of the moon. Apollo 15 was the first time that they rolled this guy out. Does anybody know what this is? What it looks like? What does it look like? It's a rover. So this is the lunar rover. Sorry, question? Okay. So the lunar rover opened up all kinds of possibilities for them to actually explore the environment around where their landers were. So it could go about 12 kilometers an hour. I did read about how the way they planned their missions was they never wanted them to get so far away from their lunar module that they couldn't walk back if they had to. Kind of defeats the point. But so what that meant was they would go to the furthest distance that they were going to actually have to traverse, and then they would slowly make their way back so that they would never get stranded so far away from the lunar lander that they couldn't make it back. Apollo 16 was on the Highlands. Apollo 17 was the first mission and only mission that they brought along, individuals who were not specifically astronauts. So they brought along a geologist, Harrison Schmitt. Do I have it up there? I don't have the gentleman's name. Cernan. It was the third gentleman up there. So they basically brought a geologist along with them to actually specifically look for kinds of rocks and evidence on the moon that would help them piece the pictures together. Specifically, they were looking for oxidized metals. They were looking for oxidized, basically rust on the moon that would allow them to prove that there was some sort of oxidation that was possible on the surface of the moon, which they did find. And they got to hang around and sort of do their.
I was rolling on the moon one day in a very month of December. May, when much to my surprise, a pair of fuzzy eyes. Boy, this is a neat way to travel. Isn't it great? I like to skip along. Not me, boys.
So I like playing that video just because it gives you a sense of like how far this whole program had evolved, right? I mean, this went from literally astronauts that perished on the launch pad during a test to men walking on the moon, literally singing and skipping along. We got to a point where humans could operate in this kind of an environment, a completely foreign environment, completely separate from anything any of us had ever known. And I won't go so far as to say it was routine, but they could act as humans do, enjoying the inherent joys of this experience, this unbelievable experience on another planet. And so just to give you a sense of this scale, so then once they actually got this lunar rover, now you have a sense here, again, here's the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter over here. This is the photograph that you see on the right-hand side, roughly, which was covered here. This is where the lunar module is. And now that they had the lunar rover, this allowed them to explore significantly larger amounts of space on the planet, on the moon. So now, this is to scale the Apollo 12 site, that last map that I just showed you. So now, we're talking about significant distances, right? You could go, all the way over here into Worcester. You can, way up over, past 290, south of Route 9, east of Route 20. Like this is driving distances we're talking about, literally driving distances because they have the lunar lander as part of this. So hopefully I've given you a sense of what these missions were about, and we really do focus a lot on Apollo 11. It was an incredible milestone. That is the one that we're basing all of our celebrations this week on, the 50th anniversary of that landing. But I wanted to make sure, first of all, you knew that there were other missions that also landed on the moon. All of this happened in an incredibly compressed period of time, which is really perhaps one of the more amazing things of it. So if you map this timeline from 1967, February or January of 67, when the Apollo 1 disaster occurred, all the way through Apollo 17 in 1973, that's a time span from, effectively, if you map it to current time, from 2017 to 2023. And if you go back and look at some of the events that happened immediately preceding this, 2009 is the first unmanned missions to the moon. I talked about those. The first man in space, the first American in space, that's 2011. The Kennedy speech happens in 2012. So 2012, Kennedy gives his speech, and in 2019, we're on the moon. That's to me, that's an extraordinary amount of time between when these events were actually transpiring to actually get individuals on the moon. Any questions on that?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Was the LEM originally designed with space for the rover, or did they have to have a different model when they brought the rover?
It's a great question. It was not designed for a lunar rover. So the question was it designed to actually have the rover as part of it? It was not designed at all. And so they had to, that was after manufacture an option that they added. And so basically in the descent stage, in one of these little sections here between the landing skids, was where they found space basically to accordion up a rover. So they had to figure out how to not only, the weight was not as much of a concern, it really was a matter of the space. They were both considerations, but they had to figure out how they could accordion it up and then allow them to deploy it when they actually got down to the moon. But great question, it was not designed at all, as far as I'm aware, with the intention of having a lunar rover. That was after manufacturer option. Good question. So what did we learn? So we learned a lot of things, and some of the things that we learned are, that the moon is not geologically active. It was at one point. Those big, giant, black areas on the moon, those are effectively lava flows that were caused by lava that was at the center of the moon that flowed up to the surface and spread across the surface. So we know that at one point it was geologically active. It no longer is geologically active. We know that we found evidence of water that is on the moon. Absolutely lifeless, no living organisms or fossils or evidence that life was ever present on the moon. The raw materials of the moon are extremely similar to what we find on Earth. So there are still theories, there are multiple theories about where the moon actually came from and how it actually formed. One of the main leading theories is that the moon formed when a Mars-sized object crashed into a very, very early Earth, and that the material that ejected away from this collision of these two planetary bodies, one planetary body formed the basis of what became the Earth, and the other became this set of material which coalesced in an orbit around the Earth, and that ultimately coalesced together into the moon around our Earth. Some of the other things we found was, that there's, because it's not geologically active, we see all kinds of evidence of all of these impacts, these lunar impacts. There's no atmosphere on the moon, or very, very little atmosphere. And so the impacts that occur as a result of meteors crashing into the moon remain as evidence on the moon long after the events have actually taken place. Unlike the Earth, because it is geologically active, even though we do experience those kinds of impacts, the geology on the Earth, which is active, effectively eliminates a lot of the evidence of those kinds of impacts. Those are some of the things that we learned to the moon. There's still activity and missions that go to the moon. I mentioned the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. So this is currently in orbit around the moon and it's shooting photographs. It actually is in this eccentric polar mapping orbit where they're trying to find opportunities for us to discover more water on the surface of the moon, as well as now increasingly potentially habitable areas that we could potentially think of as places where people could potentially try and set up some sort of established, I won't call it a shelter, but some way that people could actually live on the moon. This was actually just from back in March, where the LRO shed some light on lunar water movement inside of the craters. China actually had a mission called the Chang'e. This actually was significant because it was the first mission to explore the far side of the moon. And it was comprised, as you might expect, of multiple components because, again, radio signals can't reach the far side of the moon. So they needed to send a satellite in addition to the lander and the rover so that they could communicate with the satellite, with the rover while it's on the far side of the moon. The India Space Agency, ISRO, actually is in the process literally right now of trying to launch their own mission. Consisting very similar to the Chinese mission of an orbiter, a lander, and a rover. It was originally scheduled for this past Sunday. They actually pushed it to this coming week, the 22nd is Monday, I believe. So this is a current mission which is scheduled to go up in just the next week or so. And then there's sort of the objectives that NASA has of going back to the moon as well. Now it's been, for someone like me who's kind of been following this has been very interesting because under the previous administration, there was definitely a sort of desire to turn away from manned missions. There was much more of a focus on robotic missions and remote controlled missions that could go to other planets. And so manned missions were not really the priority for NASA for some time. Some of the components that they were developing, there was a rocket called Ares, it was part of the program called Constellation, that all got canceled under the previous administration. But this has recently been revived, and I can't help but wonder if some of it's related to the fact that we're celebrating the 50th anniversary, and we haven't gone back to the moon. There was a real aspirational expectation almost that, well, we did this, we made it to the moon, what's next? We should go to Mars, we should go to other planets. And there are definitely private interests, companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin, who are exploring those kinds of possibilities, but it hasn't really been a priority for NASA until relatively recently. So literally, just in the last 2 months, NASA announced that they are taking some of these components that had previously been developed, including this space vehicle called Orion, which if you look at this part here, looks kind of similar to the command module from Apollo, which it is similar. And then this rocket, which is known as, unpoetically, the Space Launch System, the SLS. So the Space Launch System, which has some evidence of what you might recognize, some might recognize from the shuttle missions with these solid rocket boosters on the side, and then this main booster with the Orion mission up at the top of it. And they've, just in May, they announced that the new program that is coalescing around this will be known as Artemis. And Artemis was Apollo's twin sister. So Artemis is currently the name that NASA is operating this under, with an attempt to go, not an attempt, it's an expectation that they want to go back to the moon, and then after they successfully learn how they can go back to the moon, not just to go and visit and come back within a week, but to actually establish some sort of a foothold that they can use to begin to learn how they can operate in deep space for longer periods of time, and then to eventually take those lessons and apply them onto the extremely difficult challenges of going on to Mars. So with that, I will play this little video, which describes a little bit what NASA's looking for. Oh, no, not this one. Sorry. This one. Oh. Here we go. So that's when you hear, and so the logo that they have at the end of the whole moon to Mars, it shows in the Apollo with the moon and then the Mars. That's really kind of how NASA thinks about it now. The moon is a place which is, not easy. I just spent a whole lot of time describing the immense amounts of challenges to get to the moon, but those are very relatively small challenges when we consider the real, true self-sufficiency necessary to go beyond the moon. Like for a human mission to go to a planet like Mars means that those astronauts, which I hope some of them will be women, will need to be able to be relatively self-sufficient. They will be far from the cradle of the Earth, and so we need to learn how to allow astronauts to be very self-sufficient when they go on these very deep space missions. Okay? So with that, I will make mention of a couple things. There are other events that are going on. If you're interested in this kind of thing, as I am, you'll be interested maybe in knowing. So on Saturday, Worcester has a Worcester on the Moon program, which has a whole bunch of activities associated with it. The Ecotarium has a program that's going on as part of this, but there's activities that are all going on downtown in Worcester. You can do a search on Worcester on the Moon and you can read about some of that. I'll also mention that there are other connections to our local communities. So the Draper Corporation, which is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Charles Draper, developed a navigation system which allowed for the astronauts to be able to navigate through the stars so they could actually know where they were on their way from the Earth to the moon. And so Draper, they did navigational systems and a couple other technological contributions to the Apollo missions. They're doing a whole program called Hack the Moon. I haven't been to it yet, but it's running through December, I believe. Not through October 5th, 2019. On Saturday, they have a simulator where you can actually get inside and there's they simulate actually landing on the moon. So if you happen to be in Cambridge on Saturday, you can check that out. But even if you're not, you can stop by. It's literally at their corporate headquarters. You can stop by it. It's in Kendall Square, and you can see these little environments that they've created to simulate, living rooms in the 1960s. And then there is an entire website which NASA maintains, which has events that are celebrating Apollo's 50th anniversary, including broadcasts. I believe tomorrow, NASA TV is going to have some broadcasts which will actually be from the Kennedy Space Center. And they'll be playing, both archival footage, and they'll also be having big parties with, musical performances. There's also a symphonic performance on the National Mall, I believe, over the weekend, which will be broadcast on PBS. So I share this with you because, there's lots of opportunity for you to learn more and to experience and participate in the celebration as NASA celebrates the 50th anniversary of the moon landing and of Apollo. And with that, I will once again ask if anyone has any questions. So one of the questions that I had when I was putting together the program was, well, what were the phases? Like when you looked at frequently in television and movies, they kind of show like when the moon landings happen, it's always a full moon. I'm not sure why, because the moon's big. It's like it's really close. But there's this really cool website that NASA maintains, which is run by they have a visualization office, which is responsible for just coming up with cool visualizations. And so they did this for the moon landings. And when I saw this visually, it kind of made sense to me because, if you look at, so this is literally, so if you look down here, I'll just orient you real quickly. Here's the date. So this is the moon phase. If you were outside and it was a clear night on July 18th, 1969, you would see a first phase, a first crescent, waxing crescent moon, phase 15%. And so it gives you a little sense of what you would see. And then as you travel through time, so this is actually the number of lunations, full moons, that occurred during the Apollo missions. And so here's where Apollo 11 landed. There's the landing site. And you can see it's when this line between day and night is what's called the terminator. And the terminator is always very close to the landing site. And so there's basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to give the pilots the best possible opportunity of seeing what the heck they were landing around, right? And so it's better to have lots of shadows that are being cast by rocks and by valleys and by the surface of the moon that you're about to land on. And there's really two opportunities for you to do that. There's when the Terminator is going into what's effectively lunar morning, like on their Apollo 15. And then there's at the end, which is when it passes back over the Terminator, but then you're into night, and they wanted the astronauts to be able to operate in the daytime. So that's why the phase of the moon is always just past the landing site for each one of the sites that were on the moon. So there's 16, you can see this here's the Terminator here, and you can see all this relief, all these like rocks and the craters and everything else inside here. So if you know if you have a map like this one, to see where the actual landing sites are, you know that that's about the phase of the moon when they actually attempted the landing and actually had the landing on the moon. And there's 17, the last one. So there's December 1972. So there you go. The NASA site has a whole lot of really cool visualizations like that. Again, you just do a search for NASA visualizations. So not exactly like looking through the telescope, but honestly, you wouldn't be able to see the landing sites with the tiny little landers on them anyway. So with that, if there's no more questions, I'm going to thank you all for your attention and for participating in this evening. I'll mention once again, there's printouts at the back of the room which describe some of the current missions to Mars to retrieve asteroid material, bring it back to the Earth, and then the Parker Solar Probe, which is orbiting around the Sun. Any last questions? I'll be around afterwards as well when I come by. Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention and thanks for being a great audience.